Welcome back to Inside Games, the only channel brave enough to turn a video games marketing festival into some kind of weird underground pit fighting ring.
That's right, my video game dollar needs to be teased out via gladiatorial combat through grandiose CG trailers and lavish marketing budgets.
So now that the dust has settled from E3 2021, let's take a look at the scoreboards. See who got the gamers the frothiest. I hate saying that word, gamers. I hate it.
I figured you wouldn't like saying gamers, and I figured you wouldn't like frothy gamers even more.
I don't like that. Sounds disgusting.
Data analysis firm Stream Hatchet posted this handy-dandy graph this week, ranking every major publisher's conference by peak concurrent viewers across both Twitch and YouTube.
Shockingly, Nintendo's Direct takes the cake at a peak live viewership of 3.1 million. That actually beat out Xbox's 2.3 million, Ubisoft's 1.4, Square Enix's 1.3, and Devolver Digital's 1.1 million viewers.
I gotta take a second to fanboy right there. It's pretty astounding that Devolver Digital is putting up numbers like that, even remotely similar to massive companies like Square Enix or Ubisoft. According to Wikipedia, this is a company that only employs 20 people, yet their E3 productions are so insane that they're still able to grab people's attention, which, all goes to their catalog. So they're doing their job, and they're doing it exceptionally well. Just wanted to shout that out. That's pretty cool.
But the real shocker here is that Nintendo grabbed substantially more live viewers, almost 35% more, than Xbox.
Yeah, and Xbox even premiered Starfield, which, that's the next game from Skyrim developers Bethesda Game Studios. It's Skyrim in space, and people love Skyrim and space together. You'd think it would just freak people out.
Sounds like a match made in heaven, but the viewership numbers would imply that more people are interested in Breath of the Wild 2 than Starfield. You just made me think, am I more interested in Breath of the Wild 2 than Starfield? And the answer is, yes, I am.
Wow, actually, that's pretty impressive, Bruce. But let me phrase it another way. Did you tell me that Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be a bigger game than Starfield?
Well, hold on. If it'll make you click on the YouTube video, Lawrence, I'll say just about anything. Whatever you want. I've got a 12-inch penis, and you'll see it here on YouTube.
So yeah, now that we've, it was a long path, but we've sort of justified our clickbait. There's another factor when it comes to even comparing the popularity and eventual sales of these games. Nintendo conferences are always huge wild cards when it comes to what you might eventually get.
Yeah, this year rumors even circulated that they might show the mysterious Switch Pro, even though Nintendo themselves stomped on that with a tweet an hour beforehand saying the Direct would be focused exclusively on Nintendo Switch software.
Yeah, but also, this was the first year that Xbox and Bethesda shared an E3 conference, so that fueled a lot of curiosity and interest too.
We could speculate back and forth all day about the relative viewership of these events, but it's dragging us away from what's important. Throwing down bets on these two largely unrelated games like we're watching some weird cockfight. Let's do it!
So we gotta figure out which game's gonna win. Breath of the Wild 2 or Starfield. I mean, to be honest, at this point it was a little difficult to figure out what to talk about, but I like tracking how pre-released interest converts into actual sales, or doesn't. It's an interesting narrative, and we're kind of at the beginning of that for two huge games that are part of franchises that themselves have long narratives about pre-release promotion into sales. So let's start looking at that. I think it's neat.
It turns out even that question doesn't make a lot of sense in the end due to the changing nature of game distribution. We'll get there eventually, though.
Yeah, sign of the times in the long run. But for fun, let's look at the relative sales and performance of Zelda and Skyrim to see if there's a loose correlation between current viewership trends and historical sales.
The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild launched in 2017 and sold 22.28 million units for the Nintendo Switch and 1.67 million for the Wii U, making the total amount of units sold to 23.95 million as of March 31st this year.
And by the way, Nintendo, this is weird, but thank you for the astoundingly specific and completely public sales data.
Let's compare that to Bethesda's most successful console title, I think ever, The Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim. This gets messy given that we don't really have Skyrim sales data for all the platforms Skyrim has been ported to, like the Samsung Smart Fridge.
Oh, that's cool.
So we don't know how many copies they sold on the Smart Fridge.
The most recent hard figure we have comes from a November 2016 interview with Rolling Stone that puts the game at 30 million copies sold back in 2016.
Boom, Skyrim wins. Whatever, that was years ago, 5 years ago, but Skyrim wins.
That's it, done, I guess. To be fair to Breath of the Wild, though, Skyrim has been out much longer and on many, many more platforms.
Bethesda released the next-gen version of Skyrim for Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and PC in October 2016, with a Switch version released 1 year later. On top of all that, Skyrim came to VR as well, so at this point, who knows how substantial the number of units have grown since its last update.
Yeah, and we'll probably never know now that Skyrim is it's a Game Pass TM game on Game Pass official supported platforms. But again, more on that later.
There's another factor here. Skyrim didn't launch next to Breath of the Wild. It launched in 2011 alongside The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Ugh.
Yeah, that was a rough fall to be a Zelda fan. That comparison, given that they happened at roughly the same time, is way more apples to apples. And as of December 2014, which is, it was a while ago, Skyward Sword only had 3.67 million units sold.
Wow, complete victory for Skyrim.
Skyrim was a sequel to a known franchise that sold really well in 2006's Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. So, when you think about it that way, maybe Breath of the Wild 2 is more like Skyrim than Starfield, which is a new IP on a new platform.
Oh, I see what you're saying. All right. So you're saying that Breath of the Wild 2 is Skyrim 2, and that Starfield will sell as bad as Skyward Sword.
I don't know if clickbait can give you a stroke, but I think I may have just gotten one. Bruce, did you click on that video, or are we watching it now?
Skyrim also isn't even Bethesda Game Studios' latest release. That's, technically 2019's The Elder Scrolls Blades, but their latest big non-mobile project was, of course, the hit Fallout 76, the game that everybody loves, right? So that might explain folks not canceling dates and dinner plans to watch the debut of their next big game.
On top of all of that, it's interesting to observe that both these games are releasing in different contexts and for different reasons on different platforms entirely.
Breath of the Wild 2 is a more traditional release. Plunk your money down on the counter, go home to hear Link smashing pots, screaming wildly, abusing chickens like a psychopath, hopefully on your Switch Pro if Nintendo decides to straddle console generations with Zelda again.
Meanwhile, Starfield is now an Xbox game, which means that Microsoft would rather you sign up for Game Pass than to just buy it outright at a retailer. Being on Game Pass means availability on Xbox Series X, Series S, Windows PC, and any device supporting xCloud, which soon is going to be last generation Xboxes and even just smart TVs.
That means it's going to be marketed differently and held to different success metrics than something like Breath of the Wild 2, which just needs to sell itself, and possibly an upgraded Switch.
For that reason, we'll probably never hear about traditional sales numbers for a game like Starfield. Because at that point, sales matter, but do they really matter?
I feel like they do. Sales always matter. I promise you that inside of Microsoft, all those business units definitely have metrics for those games that are on Game Pass. Whether or not you think so, they 100% are attributing specific portions of Game Pass to those games. We'll probably just never see it. The landscape is getting just incredibly complicated and nuanced. Starfield will still be available to buy at retail, but Xbox won't reveal how well the game is sold because Game Pass conversions are more important to them.
Yeah, so despite all of our thrashing around to try to force these little, action figures to fight each other, it's actually getting really hard to find any metric to actually make that happen. Games are just getting so diverse and breezy and just part of other platforms and other media strategies that sales are not the end-all be-all anymore.
In the end, we're just left with two games that both impress their expecting fans and look really fun to play. Hey, video games are cool, right, guys?
I have to admit, I did not think a new Zelda game would ever be as popular as another big open-world Bethesda Game Studios game. Granted, it doesn't have a 2 on the end, but still. What do you think? Do you think Breath of the Wild 2 will be more popular than Starfield? Or, I guess even bigger than that, do you see any trends in the relative viewer data of all these E3 publisher showcases?
So Cameron actually wrote his first-person perspective here in the script. Cameron's our writer for these scripts, but I completely agree with Cameron. I think Cameron and I both think that Breath of the Wild 2 is going to sell more. Skyrim sold a ton more, but there's a lot more in its favor, and Starfield is now exclusive, and it's a new IP. So it's not on PlayStation. It's not going to be on a bunch of other platforms. It's only going to be on Xbox, PC, and then whatever else xCloud is on. So that's going to affect sales dramatically for Starfield. Also, like Cameron wrote, and I completely agree with, Bethesda Game Studios has not had the best track record recently with Fallout 76 and even Fallout 4. A lot of people didn't like Fallout 4.
What's fascinating to me, the difference between Breath of the Wild and something like Skyward Sword is the difference between Wii owners and Switch owners.
Yes.
A lot of people own the Wii, but they didn't buy shit, whereas people buy stuff for the Switch.
That's right.
So it's got the 1-2 punch finally. Nintendo has a platform that everyone bought, and the people who own it are actually buying games too, as opposed to just playing Wii Sports once a month. That's right. Yeah, Breath of the Wild 2 has a shocking amount of momentum behind it. What's really fascinating to me about Starfield is I get the impression they're not developing it like they did Skyrim or even Fallout 4. Those games were very broad appeal. You know, you could just jump in, you could kick around some orcs, you could get kicked around by an orc. But it was just like, it was a fun game to smash buttons with and like go through quests and goof around and steal all the rocks and all that stuff.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite, it's not like a core intense, really hard RPG that would probably put people off, like, you know, Souls game or something like that. However, Todd Howard did say in an interview that they were trying to make it a little more RPG intense.
They did.
Some more stats, maybe slower gameplay. Signals to me that because of Game Pass, maybe, their goal is not to sell Starfield to every last person on the planet, and maybe they're not designing it to be as widely palatable as something like Fallout 4. Maybe it will be a little more mechanical intense. Maybe it will. Well, anyway, I think maybe what I'm interpreting is that they're actually not building this RPG to sell 40 million units. They're just building it as a game to push Game Pass for the quarter that they're going to release it in. That doesn't mean it has to appeal to absolutely everyone, which is really, really interesting.
That is, I think that's super interesting, especially from a Microsoft standpoint, since they just acquired this this studio that normally makes broad appeal games. So maybe Phil Spencer gave Todd Howard the A-OK and was like, hey, you know what? Make Starfield whatever you want, Todd.
So if you consider that people who buy Switches actually buy software, this is a sequel on a platform a lot of people already have, as opposed to something like Starfield that won't be appearing on, you know, PlayStation. So it seems like the install base is there, the brand affinity is there, the purchasing intent is there. What's really fascinating is about like a new model of Switch. Depends how many of those they can have, because that would be a great pairing to take home with it. And that's what I think pushed a lot of Breath of the Wild copies out the door. It was the game to have with the Switch for a long time. So if that's, if that's the biggest game that is a good pairing with Switch Pro and it's explicitly designed to work with that system, that's a pretty great sales deal. If Nintendo makes more than 500 Switch Pros in the first year. So we'll see. And that's the other thing too. It's like Breath of the Wild can last a long time because there's a lot of stuff in the game, but something like Starfield, Nintendo hasn't really done a whole lot of games of service stuff outside of Splatoon. Starfield could be a games of service. They could add whole new quadrants to go visit and new planets. There could be a Starfield Q3 2022 update where hey, there's new spacesuits and we just added 5 more spaceships and it's just on Game Pass and go download it. So it may be a long tail, updated kind of Sea of Thieves sort of deal, just in space instead of on the ocean. Something to consider, and that's what makes comparing sales even more hard to do, because it's not really about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We keep saying that. We say that about review scores too, where it's always like, it's not about review scores, but you know what? Look, we all want to glance at a number and be like, what's bigger? That's what we like. That's what everybody wants to see. They want information at a glance. So there will probably never get sales numbers for Starfield. We probably will for Breath of the Wild 2. I'm gonna put a stake in it right now. I think Breath of the Wild 2 sells more than Starfield for the next 10 years. There is a caveat here. Unless Starfield becomes the next Skyrim, which I don't necessarily think any game can do. I think Skyrim is like a once-in-a-generation type thing. Especially because the game's been out for 10 years. They haven't put a sequel out. So I don't know that Starfield's going to become that. However, I'm very much looking forward to Starfield. I can't wait to play it. I'm not shitting that game at all. I'm going to play the shit out of it. So
I actually think you nailed it, Bruce, because Breath of the Wild 2, it's got a number, and Starfield doesn't. So if you look for those numbers, you're like, 2 is right there.
You know what? Everybody played Breath of the Wild. It's one of the greatest games of all time. At least a lot of people say so. So are you going to buy the sequel to the greatest game of all time? The answer is yes.